All right, well, let's go ahead and begin the endocrine system. Now, as you guys can tell by the size of our packet, this is a very long lecture, okay? And there's a lot of information that we're going to cover. For that reason, I'm actually going to double the number of questions I pull from this packet. So on your test next week, there will be 40 questions coming specifically just from this packet alone. Okay? And that is just demonstrated by how much we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of different parts to our endocrine system, or organs to our endocrine system. As you can see here, we have a figure that's really illustrating some of them. Most of the things that we see here labeled are going to be discussed either this week with the endocrine system or kind of later in the semester, because there's a lot of different parts of our body that produce hormones, and therefore just considered to be part of the endocrine system. We've learned since the beginning of this semester that the endocrine system uses hormones. Hormones that are produced by secretory cells and released typically into the interstitial space, which then allows them, the hormones that is, to be picked up by our blood and then carried to target organs or target cells located generally in far places away from the organ that secreted them. So typically, the body synthesizes hormones in one part of the body, transporting it to another by way of the bloodstream or lymph. And therefore, the endocrine system must, or the endocrine glands must have a rich blood supply to pick up those hormones. Okay. What the hormones will do when they get to the target organs is increase or decrease their activity, which is all geared towards maintaining homeostasis. We've used that term homeostasis, that's the linchpin of this class. We've learned that since the very beginning of the semester that the nervous and endocrine systems are the two major systems related to homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis. So that's why I like to transition from the nervous system right into talking about the endocrine system before we really get into any of the other system in the body. Now, we classify the endocrine organs based on if they are completely endocrine, meaning that all they do is produce hormones, which includes both parts of the pituitary, your thyroid, the 4 parathyroids, 2 adrenals. We've actually talked about the adrenals, or part of the adrenals anyway, so far. And then your pineal gland, which we've also talked about before. Okay, those strictly, all they do is produce hormones. Okay, but as you can see, there are other organs and tissues that are built for a primary function of another system, like the liver, the pancreas, which are built specifically more for digestion, but produce hormones, and so therefore we talk about them in this lecture. Okay. It includes your hypothalamus, which we've talked about before, the major control center of your autonomic nervous system, but it's also the major control center of your endocrine system. Your thymus, which we'll talk about when we get to the lymphatic and immune lecture, so it's part of the immune system. Your pancreas, your stomach, your liver, and your intestine, small intestine are all digestive in function primarily, but they do produce hormones. Ovaries, testes, placenta, predominantly reproductive in function. And then you've got the skin, which we don't really even talk about it in this class at all too much. The heart, we'll talk about its role with producing a hormone. Your kidneys produce a couple of hormones. And then your fat actually produces hormones, but we don't really talk about fat as an endocrine organ in this class. Interestingly enough, I talk about the muscles, which I don't have listed here. Skeletal muscles actually will produce hormones, but I don't talk about that in this class, so I didn't list them. If you want to learn more about muscles as endocrine glands, you can take exercise physiology with me when I do talk about it. Together, those many structures provide us with control and integration, which we can classify kind of 6 different ways. Our responses to stress and injury, the production and usage of energy, so energy metabolism, water and electrolyte balance, growth and development, absorption of nutrients, reproduction, birth, and lactation. Okay. All very important functions. Without those, we're not really going to survive very long at all. Now, since we just finished up talking about the nervous system, and we're all very aware of how the nervous system functions. Wanted to kind of demonstrate some areas of similarity and some areas of differences between the nervous and endocrine systems, which, as we know, are the two major systems involved with maintaining homeostasis. The nervous system, as we know, uses action potentials, which are electrical signals, but also chemicals called neurotransmitters. The endocrine system is strictly chemical, and those chemicals are hormones. Okay, so there is no electrical signaling in the endocrine system. Speed and persistence of response is very different. Okay, they say you can compare an action potential to a text message, and the release of a hormone and its action being more like a letter in the mail. Okay, which one's going to get there faster? Obviously the text message. The letter in the mail has to get there very slowly because it is going to involve passing from one place to the next and not in a direct manner. Okay. Now for that reason, the response may be much longer, several days or even weeks, continuing for the endocrine system and those hormones, whereas the nervous system, that response is very short, and the body adapts or declines that signal. The area of effect is very targeted and specific, generally one organ or two, maybe with the nervous system, the endocrine system, because those hormones are released into the blood, and the blood carries those hormones throughout the body, can be very much more widespread. Now, sometimes a hormone only acts in certain areas. For example, you have a thyroid stimulating hormone. All it wants to do is stimulate the thyroid, but it's going to be a hormone that's going to travel throughout the rest of the body. We have growth hormone that will trigger growth in a lot of things. So it can be much more widespread than just kind of one area. Several chemicals actually can function as both hormones and neurotransmitters. We've talked about this before. Norepinephrine we release as a neurotransmitter from our postganglionic sympathetic neurons. It's a hormone when it's released into the blood by the chromaffin cells of our adrenal medulla. We've talked about that before. Some hormones are actually released by what we call neuroendocrine cells, which are just neurons that release a hormone. Oxytocin is a hormone that we've talked about since the beginning of the semester. We learned that it's part of that positive feedback loop involved in labor, and that's where the contractions of the uterus come from. It's released by the posterior pituitary. If you open up the posterior pituitary, like we will and see, you'll see that there are neurons that are releasing it. The two systems have overlapping effects on the same target cells, like norepinephrine and glucagon, causing the hydrolysis of glycogen in our liver, and then they regulate each other. Neurons will stimulate or trigger hormones to be secreted, and hormones can either inactivate or inhibit or stimulate neurons. So a lot of coordination. And sometimes people describe the relationship between the two as what we call the neuroendocrine system. All right, so what we're going to do now is actually get into activity of hormones and how they work. I've already talked about this, but hormones travel throughout our body and generally are going to be carried in our bloodstream and are going to target specific organs or cells or tissues. But how do they know who to target and what to target? Okay. Earlier in the semester, we described a lock and key mechanism with regard to enzymes and substrates. Well, the same relationship exists between hormones and protein receptors. Okay. Hormones, due to their shape, are only going to interact with cells that have the receptors for that hormone. Okay, like we show down here on the bottom right, where we've got the hormones from the endocrine cell traveling in the bloodstream, exiting the bloodstream, and only being able to interact with the cells that have the specific receptors. Okay. Non-target cells, you can see with the green receptor and the purple receptor, are not the correct shapes. A lock and key mechanism that exists. Example of this, I said your thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland. And it will only target the thyroid gland because the cells of the thyroid gland have the receptors for thyroid-stimulating hormone. Here listed was the big toe and uterus, both receiving the hormone estradiol, which is secreted by the ovaries of females. But the big toe, unlike the uterus, doesn't have the receptors for estradiol, so therefore will not be affected whatsoever by estradiol. Speaking of those receptors, our receptors are constantly synthesized and broken down by the cells. Generally, the number can range between 2,000 and 100,000. It's a very big difference. And we will change the number of cell receptors or hormone receptors based on the concentration of the hormone in the body. If there's a whole bunch of a hormone, we aren't going to need as much receptors. We'll perform what we call downregulation. Okay? Where we'll take away the number of receptors in order to make them less sensitive to the hormone. The opposite of downregulation, obviously, is upregulation, where we're going to increase the receptor number, and that happens when we are deficient or lower in amount of a hormone. This makes the receptors more sensitive. Okay? Where there's less hormone, we need more receptors. Where there's more hormone, we don't need as many receptors. This should be kind of common sense stuff. All right, what we're going to do now is talk about the ways that we classify hormones. There's two different ways that we classify them. First, we're going to talk about how they circulate, and that's one way to classify them. The two classifications for hormone circulation are circulating and local. Most of our hormones are circulating, where they're produced by an endocrine cell, released into the interstitial space, picked up by our blood, and circulate through our blood, hence the name circulating, travel distantly to target cells, exit the blood, and then interact with those receptors for those distant target cells. These hormones may linger in the blood, exerting their effects for a few minutes or occasionally a few hours. Over time, they would be inactivated by the liver and excreted by the kidneys, unless one of those organs is failing, which can lead to excess levels of the hormones in the blood, which can be a bad thing. Local hormones do exactly what they sound like. They act locally, and they do so either on themselves or on a neighbor. So therefore, we have paracrine and autocrine. Paracrine, as we see here, are those where the cell releases it, and that hormone targets a nearby cell. Okay, so it's a neighboring cell for paracrine. Do you guys remember what that prefix meant? Cell. These hormones target the same cell that releases them. Okay. We don't talk about local hormones very much at all, because most of the hormones are these type. Okay, so as we get to this on Wednesday and Friday, we'll be spending the majority of our time talking about circulating. But we do mention a little bit about prostaglandins, leukotrienes, nitric oxide. Those are all examples of local hormones, which are inactivated very quickly, and they don't perform as many really complex functions. So. All right, the other way to classify hormones is based on who they are soluble in, or what they're soluble in. You guys remember what we described soluble as being? What that word meant? It can basically dissolve in. So there's two classes, lipid soluble and water soluble. And we can see a picture down here at the bottom with a lipid soluble hormone that has to be carried in our blood by way of a transport protein, and water soluble, which don't. Okay. The reason that lipid soluble hormones have to be carried by a transport protein in our blood is because guess what's in our blood? Lots and lots of water. And what do we know about lipids and water? They don't mix. They don't like each other. Okay. So things that are lipid soluble are just like lipids, or in some cases like steroids are lipids, and therefore don't really like to be around water. And so those transport proteins help to allow them to be in our blood where there's a lot of water. Okay. The three types of lipid-soluble hormones include steroids, which we learned previously are a form of fats. Primary type of steroid is cholesterol, and that is used to make these various hormones, each of which is unique due to the presence of different chemical groups attached at various sites on the four rings at the core of its structure. Okay. And we'll talk about how these can travel really directly through the plasma membrane of the target cells. Examples are the various sex hormones, testosterone in men, estrogen and progesterone in women. Thyroid hormones T3 and T4, obviously produced by the thyroid gland. These are two hormones derived from tyrosine, nonpolar amino acid, and these are the only hormones that include iodine as part of its structure. And then finally, a gas known as nitric oxide, NO is its abbreviation. Actually, it's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. We don't really talk about it a whole lot in this class. It actually vasodilates your blood vessels, and that's about the only really time we'll talk about it as a potent vasodilator. The other class of hormones are the water-soluble hormones, which have no problem whatsoever traveling in a free state, which means that they don't need a protein to carry them because they don't mind the watery plasma of our blood. It includes your amines, which we form when we decarboxylate or remove a CO2 from a amino acid. We call them amines because they still have the amino group of the amino acid. Okay, this includes epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, histamine, serotonin, melatonin. Some of those we've talked about before. Peptides and protein hormones made up of amino acid polymers, so taking amino acids and binding them together. The difference is their size. Peptides are much shorter, 3 to 49, whereas proteins are much longer, 50 to 200. Oxytocin, antidiuretic are examples of peptides. Thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, insulin, examples of proteins. Several protein hormones are attached to carb groups. We call those the glycoprotein hormones. And then finally, some of your local hormones are going to fall into the eicosanoid hormone category. These are made up of a 20-carbon fatty acid, and we don't talk a whole lot about these, but we will mention and talk. I think we'll spend one whole slide talking about prostaglandins and lipid so we'll get to those.
Do you know all the other examples?
Like where they fit? No, I wouldn't worry about like knowing where nitric oxide or like prostaglandins and lipid. Just know like the bolded parts that fit in where. Okay. Table 18.2 just basically is illustrating the same thing I just talked about. Now, the importance of knowing lipid-soluble and water-soluble relates to how they function when they get to the target cells. And so that's what we're going to talk about right now. The ultimate result is essentially the same thing, but the way that they get there is a little bit different. Okay. Once again, lipid-soluble hormones need a protein carrier. You can think of it like a cab or a ferry to transport them in the blood. Okay. These transport proteins are made in our liver, and they make lipid-soluble hormones temporarily water-soluble. They retard the loss of these hormones in the kidneys so that less hormones are lost in urine and provide a ready reserve of these hormones in our bloodstream. Okay. Now, lipid-soluble hormones have the capacity to go directly into our cell. Okay, and that's illustrated here with step 1 on our figure here on the next page. Okay, after the hormones break free of the transport protein and leave the blood, they diffuse directly into the cell. Why can they go directly in the cell? Because they are lipid soluble, right? What makes up the plasma membrane of our cells? Because remember, it had a head and 2 tails. They make a bilayer. Phospholipids, which are fats, and fats that can be traveled through by lipid-soluble hormones. So these hormones will come into the cell and target the nucleus, targeting nuclear receptors located in or around the nucleus, that alter gene expression. You guys remember gene expression was where we take DNA, make RNA, which is then used to make proteins. Okay, we see that here in our figure. We activated coding for RNA from DNA, which then the RNA is used to make proteins, and look what the proteins do. They alter the cell's activity. So it's not the hormone that's producing the response, it's the activation of certain proteins. And remember, proteins do everything in our body pretty much, right? Okay. Now, these hormones are very strong, as in they have a strong action, and act slowly, hours to days, but their effects can be very long-lasting. They're different than the water-soluble hormones, which is it states down here at the bottom. Their action is very short-lived, seconds to minutes, before being inactivated. These guys are not going to travel through that lipid bilayer because, remember those tails on the phospholipids were hydrophobic. So they don't like water and things that are water soluble. So what we do here is bind to a receptor on the outside. Our hormone binding to that receptor acts as a first messenger. Now, it's a series of steps. A G protein is activated. Adenylate cyclase is an enzyme that's activated, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is our second messenger. This then activates protein kinases, which are enzymes that take a protein and add a phosphate to it from ATP. The protein that's phosphorylated now causes a reaction that produces a physiological response. We get there differently, but ultimately it's the same end game. Proteins, which then alter the cell's activity. Now, as I just said on the previous page, these guys work really quickly, but then are inactivated really quickly because there's an enzyme, phosphodiesterase, that will inactivate that second messenger system, that cyclic AMP. Do you guys remember last week we talked about second messenger systems with regard to some of our special senses? We talked about smell and taste. Now, not all the things we taste involve a second messenger system, but some of the things we taste are. And the things that we smell use this same, essentially, process. So does everybody see the difference between coming into the cell versus, second messengers on the outside? You're not going to have to walk yourself through all these steps, I promise you that. But you should be able to identify which ones circulate in a free form, which ones use the second messenger system, which ones can go into the cell directly, which ones cannot, so on and so forth. All right, it is 10:50. If you guys want to write this out, you can. We'll pick up with hormone responsiveness on Wednesday. Oops, I'm not going to change pages.